Ever since the climate alarm was raised back in the 1980s, there has been a global shift towards renewable energy. Because energy production accounts for roughly 72% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, many have searched for cleaner and more sustainable ways of producing energy. And renewable energy, compared to fossil fuel alternatives, has proven to be an effective solution to these concerns. But because of this comparison, renewable energy is often placed on somewhat of a pedestal in the public eye. In reality, renewable energy has several hidden costs and environmental impacts that are often ignored. For example, hydropower dams can have a large impact on the local fish population and require large swaths of land. As well as that, there are some non-renewable sources, such as nuclear, that are actually cleaner for the air than other renewable sources. So, in this video, instead of just focusing on renewable energy, I would like to expand our horizons towards clean energy, which is energy that, theoretically, doesn't pollute the air while being produced. But as we'll see later on, in reality, everything has a carbon footprint. Starting off, one of the most widely recognized forms of clean energy is solar power. Utilizing the power of the sun, solar power converts either its heat or light into electricity with the use of mirrors or batteries respectively. You probably recognize the latter, which is a type that you can find on roofs or in calculators. Because the sun's energy is practically free, energy from solar is able to be produced cheaply. Along with this, solar power releases very few emissions during operation, with most emissions being associated with machinery at the power plant. This is due to the nature of where the energy comes from. In his book, Environmental Impacts of Renewable Energy, Frank Spellman says that the sun is one of the cleanest sources of energy available. Yet, despite this, solar generally has a higher carbon footprint compared to other clean energies. Why is that? As it turns out, most emissions from solar are a result of construction and decommissioning. When building power plants, all the concrete, turbines, transmission lines, transformers, etc. will have a carbon footprint associated with them. For solar panels specifically, they will take between 1 and 3 years before they become carbon neutral. Solar panels also require toxic materials during construction, and if not managed properly, these substances can end up contaminating groundwater and polluting the air. For both types of solar power, they can also have an effect on the local ecosystem. Local bird and insect populations may mistake the reflective surfaces of solar power plants as bodies of water, and the mirrors in concentrated solar power plants can burn birds flying above them. So, when building new power plants, it's important to consider all of these downsides in order to avoid harming the local ecosystem. Anyways, moving on. Another popular form of clean energy is wind power. Energy from the wind has been used by humans ever since the first windmills were invented. And since then, it has been the most environmentally friendly form of energy currently available to us. It doesn't require a lot of land, it has one of the lowest CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour, and doesn't have a large impact on the local ecosystem. As you can see behind me, wind turbines mainly take up vertical space. This allows it to coexist with things such as livestock, crops, and highways. Today, most wind farms are built in rural areas where they are integrated with agriculture and infrastructure. Although this is a useful characteristic, that doesn't take away from its carbon footprint. Just like solar power, most emissions released by wind energy are released during the construction and decommissioning phases. But in contrast to solar, wind doesn't need any toxic substances or as many materials to be built, which makes these stages of the life cycle much cleaner. They still require many vehicles burning a lot of fuel to carry heavy loads on and off the building site, but because there are fewer materials, they can take fewer trips. Aside from the carbon footprint, there are still some ecological effects, regardless of how small they are. For instance, you may have heard about how wind turbines are killing birds! In reality, although the number is significant, wind turbines only make up a fraction of all bird deaths, and they kill far less than the fossil fuels they replace. One final point to note is how wind power is inherently inconsistent. Because it relies on the weather, whenever conditions aren't optimal, such as wind speed being too high or too low, energy production can slow or even halt entirely. When building energy infrastructure, the cleanliness and efficiency of wind energy are both very compelling traits. Throughout the Midwest states, wind energy makes up over half of all electricity produced. But even with these high prospects, it's important to understand the downsides so that they can be mitigated as best as possible. Now finally, let's talk about hydropower. Out of all the types of clean energy, hydropower is one of the most powerful and reliable. Hydropower dams can store more than 30 megawatts of electricity in the reservoirs while having a lifespan of 80 to 100 years, and with proper maintenance, can theoretically last forever. These benefits have made hydropower very popular in countries such as China, Canada, and Brazil, with China in particular producing about 1,302 terawatt hours a year with it. But these benefits can come with potentially dangerous downsides if not managed properly. So the way that hydropower generally works is that there will be a dam built at the bottom of a hill so that water can collect at the top, flow through turbines in the dam, and then be released at the bottom. The only issue is, these dams can cause a lot of problems if the location isn't well thought out or if the local ecosystem isn't taken into account. Although the dams can help prevent floods, the reservoirs can completely flood previously dry areas. An infamous example of this would be in Balbina, Brazil, where 2,500 square kilometers of Amazonian rainforest were flooded for a hydro plant. This flooding causes a lot of plants to die, and as the organic matter rots, they will start to release CO2 into the atmosphere. This brings up another issue of land usage. Hydro plants tend to take up a lot of space that could be used for other purposes, such as housing. Sometimes millions of people are relocated for the purpose of building a dam. These dams and their large reservoirs can serve other purposes though. They are often utilized for fishing or collecting water once constructed, and the dams can act as tourist attractions. Speaking of fish, these dams do have some ecological effects as well. Hydropower dams have been observed to disrupt fish spawning, decrease the quality of water, and if fish elevators aren't installed in the dam, then it makes it impossible for fish to migrate further upstream. Overall, hydropower is a very powerful and reliable source of clean energy that has the potential to power an entire country. On the other hand, it also has the capability to do a lot of harm to the environment, more so than many other clean energies. But with proper care and caution, these detriments can be alleviated and ecological damage can be avoided. And that's really the main idea of this video. Although clean energy is great for the environment compared to fossil fuels, it does come with risks. Even if these dangers do not necessarily harm the environment more than fossil fuels do on a regular basis, it is nonetheless vital to make sure that they are considered during development, accounted for, and alleviated in order to ensure the least amount of damage to the environment as possible. So, there's another type of renewable energy I would still like to go over, even if it's not exactly clean, and that would be bioenergy. Bioenergy is energy that is derived from burning organic matter rather than fossil fuels. If you own a car, you've most likely used bioenergy before in the form of biofuel. If you're at a gas station and you choose to pump E85 into your car, it will contain anywhere from 51 to 83% ethanol, which is a type of biofuel. By now, you've probably connected the dots, but the reason that bioenergy isn't clean is that it's still burning stuff. Burning anything will release a lot of CO2 in the air, and this makes bioenergy the most polluting form of renewable energy. Although it is a renewable source, most would argue against it being included in the category of clean energy. Despite this, I still want to examine it because in spite of the downsides, it does have a valid use case. Also, this is my video, so I get to examine whatever I want. Anyways, as I went over previously, you most likely already know about biofuels. In my opinion, this is the most valid purpose for bioenergy. In transportation, using organic fuel over pure fossil fuels not only emits less, but it uses carbon that is already on the surface rather than pulling up carbon that has already been deposited in the earth. On top of that, it also recycles crops that would have otherwise been wasted. But as for using bioenergy in full-scale power plants, its only real benefits over fossil fuels are independence from fossil fuel imports, being renewable, and reduction of waste. Other than that, biopower plants release more CO2 than coal plants, are less sustainable than other renewable sources, and can even lead to deforestation. Because organic matter, such as wood, is less energy dense than fossil fuels, more of it needs to be burned for the same amount of electricity, which releases more emissions and requires more fuel than can be healthily recycled or harvested. Because of these factors, I don't see biopower as being a very viable way to combat climate change. However, I believe that biofuel has the potential to reduce global emissions and be a significant factor while we transition from gas-powered vehicles to electric ones. Now that I got that out of my system, let's focus back on clean energy. Specifically, let's talk about nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is often portrayed in the media as unclean and dangerous, but as it turns out, that's not quite the case. In fact, nuclear is one of the cleanest forms of energy in terms of air pollution, being nearly as clean as wind energy. And this gives nuclear a very important role in combating climate change, being a clean and powerful source of energy that is completely independent from the weather. Currently, this job is taken by fossil fuels, which produce power when clean sources are offline. But with nuclear energy, it can do the same job with less emissions and less fuel. Although nuclear energy isn't renewable, it can still be a useful tool during humanity's transition to fully renewable energy. But as always, there are downsides that need to be considered. First of all, nuclear energy is potentially the most dangerous form of clean energy. If a facility isn't maintained properly, then it can have devastating consequences on a city-wide scale. Instances like the Chernobyl meltdown are still talked about to this day. The other issue that nuclear faces is the waste it produces, which can be very harmful if proper precautions aren't taken. Luckily, the way we store nuclear waste today is actually quite safe. It first spends a few years cooling off and losing radiation in underwater containment before being placed in dry storage and transported to an underground repository. Today, nuclear waste has been made so safe that some power plants will even let you stand on top of the dry storage. In fact, here's a video of a storage device being hit by an actual train. Pretty neat, huh? On a related note, another type of clean energy closely related to nuclear is nuclear fusion. Now, the way nuclear fusion works is a bit too complicated for me to fit in this video, but it basically uses the same process as the sun does to create energy. This process has the potential to release zero carbon emissions, but more research needs to be done before it's viable. Nuclear fusion is still early in development, but it recently had its first test that produced more energy than was put into it. Overall, nuclear energy, as well as nuclear fusion sometime in the future, plays a very important role in creating cleaner and more reliable energy by being powerful and entirely independent from the weather. But for nuclear energy specifically, it is absolutely essential that it is handled with the utmost care. Even if the technology is safer now than it used to be, it should still never be taken for granted. But as long as these consequences are kept in mind, nuclear energy can have a positive impact on the current structure of energy production. Okay, so on a side note, there are still plenty of other clean energy types that I wasn't able to fit very well into this video, but I still want to at least mention them for anyone who's curious enough to do their own research. So basically, wave and tide energy are newer technologies that are helpful for countries on the coast and don't have a large ecological impact, but the infrastructure for transporting that energy to shore does make its carbon footprint a little larger. Now, geothermal energy can fit the same niche that nuclear does while being renewable, but it needs to be close to a fault line, so potential locations are more limited. Plus, it's a little more polluting than nuclear, but not by much. And finally, there's also carbon capturing technologies, which take CO2 out of the air and store it underground. These technologies will be very helpful in the future once they're more developed, and can potentially make a zero carbon world possible. If any of these interest you, I would highly recommend doing some more research on your own. I personally have been researching this stuff for about, say, a month or two now, and it has been very fascinating, so I would actually really recommend it. In the struggle against global warming, many people today treat clean energy as the end-all be-all to our problems. But the most important thing that I want to get across in this video is that renewable energy is not some panacea that will cure global warming while having zero impacts on the environment. Almost anything man-made is going to disrupt the ecosystem, no matter how environmentally friendly it is. I want to quickly reiterate that clean energy is still much better for the planet than fossil fuels, but that doesn't mean that they're perfect. They all have disadvantages and ecological impacts that need to be carefully considered before implementation, because if they're not, it can end up harming the local environment more than it helps. Endlessly expanding without thought is only going to harm the planet in the long run. But if we can continue to improve on the clean energy resources we have, and we continue to be aware of and properly manage their faults, then we will be able to make our planet cleaner while helping to end global warming.